Welcome to Calm Historian. Today we're stepping inside a medieval castle, where stone corridors echo with boots and bells, hearth smoke hangs in the air, and life is tightly ordered by rank and ritual. We'll wander from draughty great halls dressed for pomp and ceremony to bustling kitchens and courtyards, noticing the chill in the walls and the not-so-rosy smells of daily life. Before we begin, comment your location and your current local time. And if you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, please like and subscribe. Imagine stepping, if only for a moment, into the life of a medieval castle. You would not find a single frozen picture, but a whole arranged world, its order written into the very stones. From dawn until late into the night, every movement follows set patterns. Servants rouse the household, stoke fires and tend wakes. Squires polish armor and oil hinges. The steward marks accounts and keeps the bread reserved. The lord and his people live by routines learned over years. Formal meals at appointed hours, courts to hear disputes and hand down judgment, messengers arriving and riding away with business that cannot wait. It is a place where every role has its place, and every day its expected rhythm. Within that choreography there is pageantry. Ceremony threads through ordinary life. A trumpet calls the household from its morning tasks. A raised goblet at a feast gives thanks and tests the brewery's latest batch, and a slow procession will escort an honored guest from gate to great hall, beneath banners and pennants. These displays are not empty show. They mark rank and shape identity. The sounds of trumpets and voices, the deliberate seating at the high table, the rustle of a cloak, when a herald announces a name. Such gestures bind people to one another and lend the castle a dignity that is felt as much as seen. The rituals are small and grand at once. A toast, a bow, the measured words of a steward, or the curt order of a sergeant. Each action reinforces the household's order. Court is held in view of all, so that disputes may be settled publicly. Messengers come and go, carrying news and commands that alter the day's course. Even the practical chores are ritualized. The making of bread and beer, the mending of mail, the keeping of accounts. These regular tasks give shape to life, and in their repetition the community finds stability. Yet the castle is also a body to be lived in. Stone is patient and unyielding. Its walls keep out attackers, and more stubbornly, warmth. Rooms are often cold even when hearths burn. The high-vaulted great hall throws heat up and away. Draughts trace invisible lines under doors and through arrow slits, and tapestries do their best to catch the chill. People compensate with layers of woolen fur, cloaks pulled tight, braziers set near gatherings, and the close press of bodies at table. In winter, warmth feels like an aspiration rather than a constant companion. And then there is the smell, honest and unavoidable. From the kitchens, the heart of the castle's bustle, clouds of steaming meat, spiced sauces, and baking bread drift out to meet the ever-present smoke of hearths and ovens. A stranger quickly notices scents less easy to make pretty. The animals kept within or close by the walls, the damp of stone after rain, the pungent odors of refuse waiting to be carried away, and the iron tang of sweat and leather from those who wear armor and work hard. With no modern plumbing and little hot water, bodies and fabrics carry the day's labors. The air itself remembers them. This is not mockery, but the honest texture of people living closely together. Sound gives the place its living rhythm. Boots and mail clank on staircases. Private counsel is spoken in low tones, laughter and songs rise in the hall, while the smithy's hammer beats out a steady accompaniment as weapons are mended. A watchman calls from a turret when night grows suspicious. Even silence has shape here. The hush that falls when the Lord speaks, or the way snow muffles the world outside, so the castle seems for a time an island. These noises, and their absences, make the castle a theater of human voices. Seen together, the castle's order and its ceremony, its chills and its smells, create a setting both austere and vibrant. It demands discipline and honors tradition, but within its rules live the warm, complicated business of daily life, shared meals and reconciled disputes, small acts of kindness and flashes of pride. Picture the contrast, the glitter of a feast and the soot on a child's cheek, and you understand how every ritual and every ordinary task move in concert, shaping a community as enduring as the stone that shelters it. Essentially, castles were at the heart of medieval society. After 1066, when the old order in England was overturned, stone and timber began to rise across the countryside like a new language of power. On hilltops and river bends, along village edges and at the crossroads of ancient tracks, men drove posts into earth and hauled stones into place. Where once there had been only fields and thatch, a new silhouette appeared, a raised mound crowned by a wooden tower, or later a squat, stern keep of dressed stone. These were not just buildings, but declarations, visible for miles, announcing that the world had been reordered. Each fortress spoke in the same blunt, unmistakable voice. Perched on a motte, or ringed by a deep ditch, with palisade and gate, it proclaimed who commanded this land. Thick walls sheltered a garrison, and the lord who claimed the soil. Narrow windows watched the lanes and the fields like alert eyes. Inside, the great hall gathered men of rank, and the tenants who served them, while outside the daily noises of the bailey, the smith's hammer ringing, the clatter of hooves, the low call of a sentry at dusk, marked the rhythm of a place built to hold power. But these structures did more than defend. They shaped how people lived and who they were. The new architecture cemented a system of obligations and loyalties we call feudalism, a social order made of oaths and tenure. Vassals came to the gate to pledge service and enter the lord's protection. In return, they held land, answered summons, and supplied men for war. The castle was the physical fulcrum of that relationship, a constant, visible reminder that promises were not abstract, but backed by stone and soldiery. From its chambers, a lord could do the everyday work of rule, convene his household, administer justice, collect rents, and send patrols across his domain. For the people who lived nearby, farmers bending their fields, craftsmen at their forges, lesser knights polishing mail, the sight of the keep shaped daily life. It offered shelter in winter, a command in times of trouble, and a place where disputes were settled and judgments handed down. Seen against the landscape, each new fortress tightened the weave of this feudal fabric. One by one, scattered loyalties of an older age were drawn toward these centers of authority. Castles did not merely occupy the earth. They ordered it, aligning land, service, and power so that a local lord's rule was at once visible and enforceable. In their shadow, a system of mutual obligation took its enduring, often stern, form, and the countryside itself came to reflect the shape of that rule. Inside a medieval castle, life never sat still. Before dawn, the kitchens were a world of heat and clatter. Cauldrons seethed on open hearths. Spits turned slowly over coals, and the sweet smoky promise of roasted meat rose in ribbons through the rafters. A chorus of voices, barkers, scullions, and seasoned cooks called orders, beat eggs, and stirred thick pottages, while bakers shaped loaves and pastry and flour drifted like dust motes in the firelight. For a moment there might be stillness when an oven door opened, and a warm, yeasty breath rolled into the corridor. But the work was relentless and purposeful. Every chopped root, every salted fish and pot of stew mattered to a household that fed dozens, from the lord at the high table to the laundress by the well. Beyond the kitchen, the great hall was readied for its own life. Benches were brushed, long tables set, pewter and wooden platters stacked and polished, and tapestries smoothed so their colors would glow by torchlight. When celebrations came, the hall transformed. Laughter and stories filled the air. Minstrels tuned strings and pipes. Silk rustled and heavy boots thumped on stone. Behind that revelry, though, there were careful, quiet preparations. The steward kept the schedule, the hearth was kept fed, and servants moved with the steady efficiency of a practiced machine so that the evening would run without a hitch. Above and beside all this industry, the castle chapel kept a gentle, unhurried rhythm of worship. Bells called the household to prayer, candles were trimmed, and a priest intoned in Latin or the local tongue inside a small, echoing space where people came for comfort, thanks, or counsel. Whether it was a hurried sign of the cross before a meal or a longer service at dusk, the chapel's hush wove through the daily noise, a quiet reminder that amid labor and feasting, the life of the soul was tended as carefully as any hearth or table. The layout of a typical medieval castle was shaped as much by domestic needs as by defense. Within those thick walls were kitchens and halls, bakeries and sleeping chambers, yet evenings they were lit, not only by tallow candles and torches, but by a constant, restless readiness. Behind the hush of tapestries and the clatter of pots, the household that kept the lord in power was quietly a small disciplined army. That tension threaded every comfort and every chore, a gentle current under the ordinary life of servants and nobles alike. Morning in the courtyard could break that hush with a sudden practiced noise. The measured rhythm of hooves, the scrape of leather, the metallic ring of steel. Knights and their squires moved through a daily ritual of preparation, riding figures on the dusty yard, practicing the tilt with lance and shield, rehearsing footwork with sword and dagger, until muscle and instinct spoke the same language. It was not sport alone. Each pass, each drill, was habit-fashioned to answer a single, stark need, to be ready to defend the Lord, and through him the king, whenever duty called. Training ran on beside everyday life and under the very shadow of the walls. Young men learned to shoot the longbow and steady the crossbow. They practiced forming ranks, closing ranks, hauling cumbersome shields into place. In the smithy, the chorus of hammer on anvil never stopped. Armorers and blacksmiths mending helmets, tempering blades, adjusting harnesses, so a knight's mail would not fail him at the moment of truth. Squires moved like technicians in a theater, tending horse and gear, learning to anticipate the mounted man's movement and the timing of a weapon. The air smelled of sweat and leather and hot metal, and beneath the bustle there was a steady thread of tension, a recognition that the castle's peace could be broken at any hour. A castle was a fortress in miniature, and much of life there revolved around practical preparations against siege. Granaries and cellars were kept full of grain, salted meat, and dried legumes. Casks of beer and wine stood where water might run short. Wells and cisterns were cleared and guarded. Livestock were penned inside the bailey when danger loomed, and stores were inventoried with a careful, almost fearful precision. Carpentry and masonry were never truly finished. Timber was kept ready for repairs, and stones were readied for patching crumbling battlements. Gates and hinges were oiled and tested, so they would not fail when pushed upon by an enemy. When the alarm fell, the castle transformed. Sentries mounted watch in towers, peering into the dusk for signal fires or the glint of approaching mail. Trumpets and horns could summon the household in a heartbeat. From crenellations and hoardings, archers and crossbowmen took up their positions, loose shafts thudding into twilight and finding gaps in shields and armor. Shutters and bars fell into place. The great wooden drawbridge rose to deny passage, and the iron portcullis slammed down to buy precious breath. Murder holes and machicolations, openings in the battlements, became dark mouths through which stones, boiling liquids, and other horrors were dropped upon those who tried to climb or batter the gate. Hoists and winches hauled stores and munitions across the inner yard. Ropes and tackles shifted great barrels and bales into more defensible positions, turning the castle's stores into weapons as much as supplies. In those charged moments, fear and resolve braided together. Behind the walls, women and children huddled in chosen rooms while seasoned men checked one another's gear and whispered last instructions. There was a fierce, stubborn dignity in the routines, the quiet pride of a watchman who knew his post, the dry humor of a squire steadying a trembling colt, the hard comfort of comradeship among men who had practiced together until reflex and courage were one. Even on the most ordinary days, the machinery of defense, both human and built, turned and was rehearsed and maintained, a sober reminder that every aspect of castle life existed in service of protection. So the sounds of a castle are never only of domestic ease or only of war. They are a weave of both. The clang of metal from the forge, the measured beat of training horses, the furtive stalking of provisions, all these noises and actions joined into a single purpose: to keep the Lord and his people safe when the world beyond the walls grew dangerous. In that constant preparation, within hall and smithy and on the battlements, the castle held its life, a living place where hearth and harness, comfort and defense were inseparable. Before an enemy could set a foot against the walls, they had to cross a landscape made to swallow them whole. Broad moats cut a cold, dark ribbon around the fortification, their surfaces sometimes studded with cruel rows of spikes driven into mud and water to catch a boat, a horse, or a frantic man flailing for purchase. The moat was more than a ditch. It was a deliberate no-man's land, where heavy armor became a weight and courage a hazard. Mist rising off the water hid jaws of timber and iron, until it was almost too late, and the sound of a struggling horse or a splash could mean the difference between life and death. Beyond that watery barrier rose the gatehouse, not a single door but a cunning gauntlet. Stone and timber narrowed the way into shadowed passages that funneled attackers beneath iron grills, between hidden pits, and past secret niches where defenders waited. From those netches came more than arrows, boiling oil, stones, even the taunts and insults meant to unnerve. Every plank might be a trap door, every arrow slit a promise of sudden pain, turning an assault into a confused, terrifying maze. Men moved through it like prey through a hunter's snare, while those within the walls kept a practiced calm, knowing each trick and obstacle was placed to buy seconds and lives for the defenders. Some castles occasionally even housed prisoners in their dungeons. These captives were most often held for political reasons, and sometimes the conditions they endured were terrible. Not just punishment, but a way to silence and control. The damp dungeons of Chillon Castle in Switzerland breathe a quiet, elemental history. Step close, and the stone seems to exhale, cold, wet, and patient. Moisture clings to the mortar and blackens the walls, running in little rivers that trace the roots, carved by centuries of rain and lake mist. Light, when it finds its way in, slips along the flagstones in pale ribbons and catches on rusted iron rings and the shallow hollows worn by countless boots. Sounds here are altered, swallowed, and then returned as distant, hollow echoes. A drip marks the slow passage of hours, the soft scuff of a guide's footsteps, and the low murmur of visitors become part of the room's pulse, a living undercurrent to the stone's long memory. The air tastes faintly of peat and age, a smell that raises the hairs at the nape of the neck and makes every breath feel like a small confession. Narrow doorways frame deeper shadows. Low arches speak of a practical geometry meant to hold people in and keep weather out. Where torches once flared, modern lights now only suggest the original gloom, revealing niches where an iron bolt once held a shutter, and seams where salt has leached from the stone to form pale, ghostly veins. Outside, the castle's silhouette meets lake and sky, but inside the dungeons the world shrinks to stone and the steady, inexorable movement of water. Walking these passages is to move through a concentrated past. You do not find the sensational detail of every life lived here, but you feel their presence, restraint, patience, endurance. The place rewards quiet attention. The longer you stand, the more stories gather on the air, not spoken plainly, but suggested in texture and tone. It is brilliantly atmospheric, a space that draws the imagination down into the cool, damp heart of the castle. Photograph credit, Ioan Samili, CIBY 2.0. When you step across the threshold of a medieval castle today, the hush of stone and the draft through leaded windows can feel almost sacred. But that quiet is a thin varnish over a busier past. Picture the castle as a heart that once beat loud and steady, a place where every hour brought voices, motion, smells, and small dramas, where its corridors were thoroughfares for an entire community. At dawn, the castle stirred, first slowly and then all at once. Torches guttered, rushlights were lit, and the keep's great hearths spat and roared as cooks and scullions stoked fires for a day of boiling, roasting, and baking. From the kitchen came a steady rhythm, chopping, kneading, the slap of loaves onto wooden peels, and the satisfying rise of bread mingling with the smoke and spice of meat turning on spits. In the bailey the blacksmith's hammer rang like a metronome while he shaped horseshoes and mended armor. In the stables, the soft, sweet smell of hay mixed with the sharper tang of leather and dung. Horses shuffled, dogs barked, children ran and shouted, and oxen strained at carts as supplies were hauled in. Even in the smallest hours, the castle was full of purpose and motion. Inside the walls, a careful choreography kept everything running. The steward and chamberlain moved with tireless order, keeping accounts, directing servants, and making sure food and ale were portioned from the pantry and buttery. The lord and lady passed through the great hall, the center of business, hospitality, and ceremony, where long tables were cleared and set with trenchers and goblets and whatever cloth and metal the household could spare. Tapestries and hangings did more than display heraldry. They cut the draughts, softened the clatter, and turned great spaces into places that felt lived in. In private chambers, the ladies' women bent over spinning wheels and embroidery frames, their quiet, precise work balancing the louder labor elsewhere. A chaplain slipped between chapel and hall to lift a prayer, while minstrels tuned strings and reeds, ready to ease the evening with song. There was practical motion everywhere. Water hauled from the well, chamber pots emptied into garderobes, barrels rolled into cellars, laundry boiled and beaten until cloth could be reused. Most things moved along predictable paths, so the whole household could function. Season broadened the cast of characters, from harvest hands bearing offerings to traveling craftsmen and merchants bringing goods and news. And more bodies were called in to cure meat, tend fish ponds, and store grain for winter. The steady clatter of sweeping, mending, and stoking was sometimes broken by sharper sounds. Armor being doffed and inspected, a horn blown at the gate, a sentry's call as night fell. Beneath all that bustle ran a social rhythm of its own, laughter and sharp rebuke, gossip and quiet devotion, weariness and small mercies. A cook smearing fat on a spit would pause to wipe a brow. A squire's rough hand steadied a nervous page. A lady slipped a piece of bread and a whispered thanks to a loyal servant. These moments of care and complaint are what made a castle a living home as much as a place of defense. So when you wander today through empty corridors and wide halls, listen past the echoes. Picture the clang of metal and the murmur of many feet, the tang of smoke and fresh baking, the layered hum of voices. What seems calm now was once richly occupied time, a woven, noisy, human place, where the necessities of survival and the comforts of home met beneath the shadow of battlements. Castles were built not only to defend, but to display the power and significance of their lord. Beyond the stone and battlement, there would have been a vast retinue of servants, a living web of people whose daily labor kept the household functioning and the lord's status secure. How many people would have worked or lived within a castle? The answer shifts with the stones and ramparts. Some fortresses held only a handful of retainers and a small garrison, while others swelled into something like a village under one roof. Goodrich Castle, tucked into the folds of the English countryside, was never a teeming city, but it was far from empty. Around the lord's family there would have been roughly 100 to 150 other souls, enough to feel intimate, enough to make a household live. Imagine arriving at the Bailey at dawn. River mist hangs in the air, and the castle's silhouette is solemn against a pale sky. From the towers come the sounds of the people within, the hollow clank of metal as armor is tested, the stamping of horses, a sharp laugh from the kitchens, the low murmur of men on duty. These noises are the invisible scaffolding of lordly life. They tell you who fetches water and stacks the wood, who tends the stables and the stores, and who trades sleep for vigilance at the walls. Inside, every task has its place. Cooks and scullions turn grain and salted meat into the evening meal. Carpenters and masons keep the timber and stone sound. Laundresses' hands carry the pallor of soap and ash. Squires and men-at-arms live close to the family's needs, ready to step forward when duty or danger demands it. Children's laughter and the measured instruction of tutors or elders thread through the corridors. Each occupation is a spoke holding the wheel of the household together. That figure of 100 to 150 people hints at organization, but it also speaks of intimacy and interdependence. In a place built to shelter and to command, the Lord's fortunes rose and fell with the careful labor of those around him. The castle's stones may have been cold, but the lives within them were warm with the routines of meals and markets, prayers and pastimes, repairs and gossip. When the household gathered for a feast or for council, the scene at the high table was only part of the story. Unseen hands had butchered the meat, brewed the ale, polished the utensils, and prepared the chamber. The grandeur you see rests on the quiet industry you do not. So when you picture Goodrich, its gatehouse and curtain walls, its narrow stairways and shadowed chambers, listen for the hum beneath the stones. To live in or work for a castle was to be part of a small, close-knit society where every task mattered. For a fortress of Goodrich's scale, that society was modest but complete, a community of roughly 100 to 150 people forming the world that cradled the Lord's family and kept the castle alive. A medieval household was a small world of its own, crowded with people whose names are now often forgotten. There were cooks and gardeners, grooms and horsemen, a troop of serving children and chambermaids, and above them all the important treasurers who kept the estate's accounts. Each had a part to play in the daily life of the castle, a role as fixed as the beams in its roof. At the very heart of that world stood a single room that gave the household its shape, the great hall. It was the stage and the hearth, the dining room and the courtroom, the place where business and pleasure met. Most English castles had one, a long, echoing chamber beneath heavy timbers, its flagstones worn smooth by countless feet, its walls hung with tapestries that both warmed the stone and announced the family's colors. On a raised dais, the lord and his lady sat, often backed by cushions embroidered with heraldic beasts, while everyone else took benches and stools in an arrangement as formal as any coat of arms. When the hall filled, it swelled with life. A hearth at its center threw up flickering light, and the smoke from the kitchen braided into it, carrying scents that moved through the crowd. Roasting meat, warm baking bread, pungent herbs, and the sweet tang of spiced wine. Servants moved in practiced patterns, balancing trenchers of bread used as plates, ladles of pottage, and great joints destined for the high table. Minstrels slipped between bodies, their soft instruments accompanying sharper news. The clatter of wooden bowls and the low murmur of conversation rose and fell like a tide. Hospitality itself kept a rhythm. Strangers were welcomed at the first bowl, oaths were exchanged, and lavish spreads were set out to mark alliances, seasons, and festivals, all watched by faces stitched into the hangings. Seating was never casual. Rank sat forward. The lord and lady presided where they could see the whole room, their lofty seats, both a sign of authority and a reminder of the duty to provide. Retainers and tenants took places according to station. A seat at table could be as revealing as a title or a parcel of land. The arrangement guided behavior. To sit where you belonged was to show respect. To overstep, it was to invite rebuke. In this way, the hall taught civility as much by its layout as by the words spoken beneath its beams. Beyond the ceremony, the kitchens were the hall's throbbing heartbeat. Only a short run away, they were a kingdom of heat and urgency, where cooks tended spits and cauldrons, coaxing flavor from simple stores into a meal fit for a feast. There were open fires for roasting and pots for stewing, larders where salted meat and dried goods waited, and a small army of hands to fetch, stir, season, and hurry dishes through the service. When a feast was ready, the procession from kitchen to table became a kind of pageant. When harvest failed and food grew scarce, the mood in the hall tightened and talk turned to worry and blunt counsel. So the great hall shaped the rhythm of castle life. It was where strangers were met and rumors spread, where law could be spoken aloud and laughter shared, where warmth, authority, and sustenance gathered into a single human space. To stand in such a hall was to stand at the center of the household's world, watching age-old customs of hospitality, seating and service play out beneath a roof that had seen it all. This large hall was the focus of hospitality, celebration, and the pleasures of life in a medieval castle, a place for dances, for plays, even for poetry recitals. Feasts here were lavish beyond our modern imagining, mountains of rich food, exotic spices, and sometimes the spectacle of a roast peacock, presented whole and gleaming, all heaped onto huge wooden tables that ran the length of the room. From the high, weathered crown of the keep, you can look down into the hollow of time and stone, the ruined outline of the great hall at Goodrich Castle. From that aerial angle, the long room stretches beneath you like the skeleton of an enormous animal, its walls scarred but proud, its doorways yawning where voices once flowed. Sun and shadow cut across the floor, tracing where carpets and tables must have lain. And in that play of light, the architecture still insists on the order that once governed every inch of the space. Even in ruin, the hall's hierarchy reads clearly. At the far end, where the dais once rose, the floor remains slightly higher, a deliberate platform of presence and ceremony. Picture it as a small stage or island where the most important people sat, their chairs set above the crowd like thrones. From there they looked down on everything and everyone, enclosed in a private circle, elevated against the ebb and flow of the room below. The design was not merely practical. It declared rank, authority, and privilege with the quiet cruelty of architecture. At the opposite end, the doors stand like open mouths, facing the outside world, and the line of wooden benches is still suggested in the worn stone. Those seats, close to the exits, were the places of lesser consequence, convenient for slipping away when affairs grew tiresome, close enough to smell the cold air and to hear the clatter of the outer world. The contrast between the higher dais and the benches by the doors was a choreography in stone and timber, a social map etched into the room itself. Walk the ruined floor in imagination, and you can feel how the whole hall enforced its order. The most important were framed by elevation and ceremony. The less important sat with their backs near the way out. From the keep, that arrangement reads like a simple, human story. power and proximity, prominence and departure, preserved in the bones of Goodrich Castle's great hall. Adjacent to every great hall would once have been the castle kitchen, often a sizable place where cooks and servants labored over spits and cauldrons to feed their masters and a crowd of guests. Imagine the heat and smoke, the clatter of metal, the smell of roasting meat and sharp herbs. Then remember that medieval food and drink probably wouldn't taste so good to us now, a reminder that the past nourished people in ways that belong to their time as much as their recipes. The battered outline of the great hall at Kenilworth Castle sits like a memory made of stone, a heart of architecture that no longer beats but still shapes the air around it. Walk close, and you feel the weight of its absence as much as the presence of what remains. Long, sun-warmed walls that frame the sky, where a roof once sheltered voices, and tall openings through which light pours and throws patterns across worn flagstones. Moss threads the mortar. Shallow grooves in the stone tell of hands and weather. The carved edges of doorways hold the patient cruelty of centuries. From certain angles, the ruin holds itself like a stage set, where wind and light conspire to suggest the movement of people who once passed here. Not literal ghosts, but invitations to imagine. Inside that shell, silence behaves like a living thing. It gathers in corners and slides down remaining arches, pooling around the bases of chipped pillars. When a breeze finds its way through those empty windows, it carries a faint, aching suggestion of gatherings, footsteps on the floor, laughter that has thinned with time, conversations trailing off into distant chambers. These are impressions shaped by the ruin's stubborn architecture, the way sightlines focus attention toward the dais, the simple geometry that once organized human movement and ritual. The scale of the hall becomes clearer in that quiet. Near the threshold, the sun paints the stone in long bands, and as the light shifts, the hall seems to breathe, revealing textures and shadows that make each stone feel unexpectedly intimate. Outside, the castle's earth and grass press close, softening the ruin's edges and turning sharp corners into places for wildflowers and small animals. Birds use the empty windows like perches, indifferent to the human histories written into the place. At dusk, the great hall takes on a different voice. Outlines sharpen, details fade, and the ruin becomes a silhouette against the broad English sky. Standing there, you're aware that what remains is both loss and record, a fragment that keeps the past visible without speaking for it. It asks only that you look and listen with imagination, and let the aged stones suggest the long human presence that shaped them. The solar was the private heart of the household, a long, low chamber where a softer light slipped through narrow windows and pooled on worn floorboards, and where the hearth kept a steady, human warmth. Portraits and carved seats marked the place where the lord and his lady were acknowledged, symbols of rank and continuity that watched over family life. But the room was never simply a monument. Carpets muffled footsteps, a table bore ledgers and letters, and beyond the heavy curtains the quiet murmur of servants provided a constant, reassuring background to the household's business. It was a place of work and of rest, where daily life folded into the rituals of home. Because the lord's duties often took him elsewhere, the lady learned to hold the house in his absence. She took on 1,000 small authorities, comforting an anxious child, answering petitions brought by neighbors, setting the household's routine. Staff looked to her for decisions. The steward brought accounts to be settled. The kitchen promised provisions for the day. Her power was practical and intimate. She chose who would sit by the hearth, who would be invited as a guest, how festivals and fasts would be observed. And through those choices, she kept the estate's pulse regular. When the Lord prepared to leave, the household adjusted with the same careful order. Letters were set down, instructions given, favors arranged. Tasks were distributed, and the household settled into a steady rhythm. And when he returned, the solar became a place of reunion. The hearth's crackle, the measured footsteps on the floorboards, the quiet exchange of reports and stories. In those moments of coming and going, the room revealed its true purpose, not only to show status, but to hold the small enduring comforts that make a house into a home. When a lord rode away on campaign or on business beyond the walls, he did not go alone. His servants, the groom who tended the horses, the chamberlain who looked after his bedchamber and costly things, would travel with him and return only when he did. Left behind, the castle fell into a quieter rhythm. The clatter and shuffle of constant servants thinned, and the old stone seemed to listen for the sound of hooves on the causeway. Into that hush stepped the lady of the castle. She was not mere ornament of rank, but the steady heart that kept daily life beating. She saw that the day was ordered, that meals were laid, that children and guests were tended, that the long rhythm of domestic life flowed on without falter. Her authority took the shape of small, decisive acts. A word to the cook about the stew, a careful inspection of the cellars, a choice about mendings or how stores would be rationed. These quiet commands might pass without clatter, but they were the scaffolding that held the household upright. She did not turn every wheel herself. The nitty-gritty, hauling coal, stoking the hearths until embers glowed like coals in a witch's palm, polishing great braziers, washing linen, mending tapestries where daylight had thinned them, sweeping draughty halls, belonged to her own small company of practiced hands. These servants knew the castle's moods as well as she did. What corner needed a rush mat, what cask ran low, which corridor took the chill first. Together they formed a chain of duty and trust, the lady the guiding mind, they the sinew and muscle that made the household live. And so the old stones stayed warm, and ordinary necessity went on, steady and sure, until the Lord's return. When the Lord and Lady lived in a castle, they had chambers set aside just for them, a small cluster of rooms that belonged to no one else. Privacy inside those thick stone walls was rare, a fragile luxury you could count on the fingers of one hand. Castle life was loud and exposed. Armor clanged, servants shouted, carts rumbled in the courtyard, and people flowed in and out like the tide. Even the most private bodily needs were public business. Latrines and garderobes were often communal, fodder for gossip and, to later ears, stories that sound almost shocking. Life there was threaded together by necessity more than choice. Against that clamor the solar felt like a secret. Reserved for the Lord and Lady, it usually sat at the top of a tower or in the upper rooms of the keep. Climb the narrow stair, and the sounds of the great hall begin to thin. The draughts of the stairwell give way to a pocket of warmth as you push open a heavy door. The air is different up there, quieter, a little thinner, and the small windows make every shaft of sunlight count, as if each beam were a precious coin. The name itself hints at its purpose. Solar, linked to the old idea of solitude. It was more than a room, it was a refuge from the endless performance of castle life. A place where rulers could be simply human for a while. Inside, low ceilings and heavy curtains hang like interior walls. Rugs soften stone underfoot, and a curtained bed guards against intrusion. Tapestries or painted wood panels, both decorated and insulated, keeping the chill at bay. A window seat often caught the light. From there you could look down on the courtyard, watch the slow ribbon of the river, or trace the patchwork of fields stretching away. In that light a woman might unbraid her hair, a man might unfasten his gloves, and the strict protocols of the hall could be set aside, if only for a time. The small acts of daily life took on a kind of intimacy up there. The Solar also offered the gift of choice. It was where one read a private letter, leaned close to a trusted confidant, tended a wound out of sight, or simply sat with a cup and one's thoughts. These were the little rituals and comforts that could not be had in the open bustle of the household. Located above the practical business of the castle, the Solar's position was both literal and symbolic. It gave a vantage point and a moment of respite, otherwise unavailable. If the public parts of the castle were loud, smelly, and relentlessly shared, the Solar was an island of calm. It reminds us that even in an age when privacy was scarce, people still sought, and sometimes carved out, places of quiet and intimacy. The word solar, echoing solitude, points to that very human longing. A small sunlit room where one could be alone, and for a fleeting hour, simply oneself. You stand before the blackened stone, looking at the ghost of a fireplace whose ragged mouth seems still to remember flame. The masonry is scarred and soot-darkened. The lintel bears the smooth polish of hands that once arranged kindling and stirred embers. Light slips in through the narrow window and catches on tiny crystals of flaked mortar, so that the wall itself appears to hold a memory of warmth. Imagine the hush of the chamber when it was whole, a small private room set aside from the castle's public life, a place a woman of the household could withdraw to from the clamor of long corridors and the constant coming and going of guests and retainers. This was the lady's chamber, the Solar, not merely a bed and a chest, but a pocket of privacy carefully carved out within a fortress. Here one might rest, sew, pray, receive a chosen visitor, or simply sit and look across the river valley where the water ran like a silver ribbon below. On fine afternoons, sunlight found its way onto the flagstones and pooled there, gilding dust motes that moved like slow-winged insects. A stool by the hearth would hold a kettle or offer a place to warm hands, while a window seat invited quiet watching. The distant fields, the slow drift of cloud, perhaps a heron lifting off from the river. The room softened the roughness of castle life. Cushions and folded blankets took the edge off stone, and hung cloths or a small tapestry trapped sound and made the space intimate. The air could hold the faint perfume of lavender tucked into linen chests, or the homelier smells of smoked meat and hot broth carried up from below. A needle might flash in the lamplight. A shawl would be mended by steady fingers while a child slept in the corner. Such small things made the chamber domestic in a place built for defense. That intimacy stood in clear contrast to the great hall beneath, where cooking fires, long tables, and the swell of voices filled the day. Heat rose from that bustle. The glow and warmth did not stop at the rafters, but climbed, seeping through floors and chimneys to help warm the private rooms above. In winter months, that borrowed heat made a real difference. The space between a bitterly cold cell and a room where a handful of coals could coax fingers back to feeling. Picture the quiet satisfaction of sitting near that fireplace, watching the last orange embers die, feeling in the stones beneath you the echo of the household's larger hearth keeping watch. Now with the castle partly ruined, the fireplace endures as a mute witness. It speaks in its blackened face of small, daily comforts set against the harsher rhythms of medieval life, of privacy and sunlight, of warmth borrowed from the communal heart, and of the steady human routines, mending, reading, nursing, that made these chambers not just shelter, but a true home. Don't be tempted to over-romanticize life inside a medieval castle. Close your eyes and step through the doorway. The walls are thick, bare stone, and they are cold to the touch. A cold that seems to sink into your bones. Even on a fair day, drafts slip through arrow slits and imperfectly fitted doors, turning long corridors into channels of chill that no single hearth can wholly banish. Fires burn where they can. An open brazier in the great hall, a hearth in a chamber, but smoke rises and lingers, blackening rafters and the edges of tapestries, turning whatever light does filter into a dim, amber wash. Shadows climb the walls, coals crackle, and tiny sparks float up into the gloom. Space is precious in such a place. Rooms are low and often crowded. Benches and trestle tables fill the hall, and where there is room to lie down, people do so in rows or on shared pallets. Servants, children, soldiers, and the household animals pass and repass through the same narrow corridors. Privacy is a rare luxury, more an afterthought than a right. Curtains and heavy tapestries try to muffle sound or conceal a private moment, but they are thin comforts against the constant comings and goings of a working household and the close press of bodies. And then there is the smell, a jarring, layered perfume that tells you everything at once. Smoke and wet wool mingle with the tang of sweat and body oils that go days without a true wash. Cooking stews, thick with meat and marrow, hang in the air alongside the dry sweetness of stored grain and the sour hint of decay at the margins of life. The stench of refuse, food scraps, animal dung, the household latrine's waste, mixes with damp and mold in the corners that sunlight never reaches. Where food and rubbish gather, so too do hungry creatures. Rats and mice scuttle through rafters and burrow in pantries, and fleas and lice ride on cloth and hair, small torments as persistent as the cold. You hear them, tiny claws on wood, a soft rustle in the straw, as much as you smell them. This is not a life of graceful banners and polished halls alone. Even where a noble coat of arms hangs high, the daily rhythm is shaped by stone and smoke, shared quarters and the constant presence of pests. To imagine otherwise is to forget how these ordinary realities, the chill that will not leave, the dim light, the crowded rooms, the smells, defined the lived experience inside those mighty walls. First, why were these castles so dark and cold? It begins with the raw fact of the material. Most medieval castles were built of stone. Stone makes for strong defensive walls, but medieval building techniques were basic and blunt. The masons could pile weight and hold out storm and siege, but they could not, without risk, carve the walls full of wide openings. So light and warmth was often the price paid for solidity. Perched on its rise above the river, the Keep of Goodrich had been carved out of those same needs. From the 1100s it loomed as a hard, uncompromising silhouette. Four thick, close-set walls that read from a distance like a single, immovable mass. When you stood close enough to feel the shadow it threw, the first thing you noticed was how little of the outside world it would allow inside. The openings cut into the ancient masonry were tiny, not windows in our sense, but narrow apertures that let the sky peep in like a cautious guest. Sunlight came as slivers and threads. Moonlight fell in narrow knives across flagstones and dust. Those dim slits were not decorative affectation, but structural necessity. The stone could bear only small voids, without creating weak points in the great weight of castle and roof. So light itself was sacrificed to keep the walls whole. The rooms within were given to shadow. Even at noon, the inner chambers took on a somber hush, a place where a single candle could throw a theater of wavering shapes across the floor, and where dust motes spun like tiny planets in an unwilling beam. Cold had a presence inside the keep. It settled into corners and into the very grain of the stone, patient and slow to leave. People who lived beneath those walls learned to carry heat on their bodies. Thick cloaks, heavy woolen wraps, hands kept habitually near a brazier or the hearth. No matter how fierce the fire, the stone would not hold its favor. It warmed briefly, and then returned its chill as night crept in. Sunlight warmed the outer faces for a few short hours and then retreated, and the great mass of masonry released its stored cold back into the rooms, so that any warmth felt fleeting and hard-won. There were quieter consequences in this shaped darkness. Sound behaved differently in stone. Footsteps echoed. Voices sank into a low private register. Lamps and torches became necessary companions. Their golden pools of light made everyday things take on exaggerated weight. A carved chest, a hanging tapestry, the ironwork of a door suddenly declaring their importance in the dim. Children learned the world by candlelight, tracing shapes and stories from the unreliable glow, while visitors arrived from sunlit fields into a space that seemed to exist in perpetual evening. Yet the austerity had its own strange poetry. Those narrow slits framed small pieces of sky, the way a painting frames a landscape, focusing attention rather than dispersing it. Rain could be watched as a thin streak. Stars became small, bright tokens set against a vast dark. Lantern-bearers learned to cherish small comforts all the more. A well-tended hearth, a woolen blanket, the warmth of another voice in an otherwise still chamber. The design of Goodrich's keep bound its people to a rhythm the stone prescribed. Short daylight, long hours of lamplight, an internal climate always trying to catch up with the sun. That was the truth within those 1100s walls, a place of great strength and stern beauty, where the demands of structure and survival shaped not only the silhouette of the castle, but the very shape of daily existence, and where light, when it did come, was always a thing to be cherished. Late medieval developments in architecture and the rise of Gothic castle design began to tackle some of the long-standing problems of medieval houses. By the late 1200s, castles were being built with larger windows and lighter rooms, and those changes hinted at a deeper shift in how people lived with fire and air inside their homes. For centuries, the heart of a medieval home was an open blaze, a raw, elemental thing set in the middle of the floor. Picture a wide, smoky ring where families gathered to cook, to mend, to barter stories by the leaping light. The flame was generous in its company, but miserly in its reach. It warmed only what sat closest, leaving feet and corners shivering in shadow. The smoke it threw up was a constant companion, coating hair and rafters, stinging eyes, threading through clothing until the smell clinging to a cloak could tell a stranger where a person had spent the afternoon. Life with an open fire set a steady rhythm. People huddled close and shifted nearer as embers waned. Pots were hauled in and out of the heat. Conversations rose above the crackle and the occasional spark that sailed up toward the beams. That same crackle filled the room with an acrid haze that forced coughing, darkened plaster, and made it difficult to keep any indoor space bright and clean. Rain and wind could turn the smoke into a suffocating fog. A sudden draft might send a gust racing under the eaves. Houses were lived in around that smoke, and whole ways of moving and speaking grew up to cope with it. Small manners and routines tuned to the presence of the flame. Then, in the middle of the medieval period, something began to change. The fire that had once been an open, wandering thing was held more tightly, contained so it cleansed less of the air and gave more of its warmth. For the people who first felt this altered heat, the difference was small in mechanics, but enormous in feeling. Rooms that had been perpetually dim and scented of smoke slowly became kinder to the lungs and gentler on the eye. Heat stopped being a coin you had to spend standing shoulder to shoulder. It began to reach out farther into the house, inviting people to spread out and to linger without the constant sting in their throats. It is hard to overstate what that relief meant in daily life. Meals could be prepared with less soot on the pots. Children could play a little farther from the blaze. Elders could sit without the rawness in their chests. Evenings changed their texture. Warmth became steadier, more enveloping, more breathable, and the everyday business of living felt less like concession and more like comfort. Where once smoke and closeness determined how people moved, spoke, and slept, the newer way of holding fire opened up small freedoms, cleaner air, wider rooms, a quieter, gentler kind of home. In those simple comforts, the medieval household found a new kind of ease. It was not a sudden revolution so much as a gradual unraveling of old constraints. Warmth and life began to be shared beneath the same roof in a softer, more spacious way. The change may have been measured in smoke rings and embers, but the effect was profoundly human. Small shifts that altered how people lived together inside their walls. The invention of the fireplace changed more than where people sat. It changed the very feel of a room. A good hearth warmed the air and the people, but it warmed the stones too, soaking them with heat, so the whole chamber held on to that comfort long after the embers died. In a medieval castle, that steady heat could make life markedly more bearable, turning cold, damp halls into places that felt lived in and somehow safer against the long nights. Step out of the castle and into a medieval town, and the first thing that would strike you was not the cathedral spire or the stallholders' calls, but the smell. Raw and insistent, clinging to woolen cloaks and creeping into every household. The Stratton were narrow ribbons of stone, threaded with open gutters. Chamber pots were tipped from upper windows at dawn. Dung, household refuse, and animal droppings lay where people lived, worked, and played. Children chased hoops past cesspits that had never been emptied in any orderly way. Carts of night soil creaked and trundled through alleys while flies settled everywhere. A constant punctuation to daily life. The filth was not a background detail, but a presence woven into the texture of the town. Something people learned to live with until it hardened into a kind of resignation. Daily life moved on with a practical acceptance of grime. People prayed, they purged, they boiled broths and bled the sick, doing what they could with the knowledge they had. Yet most never connected the foulness underfoot with the fevers and plagues that took loved ones. The idea that unconcealed waste coursing through a town could spread illness simply did not exist for most medieval minds. Poor toilet hygiene remained for centuries a blind spot. Only much later, not until around the 18th century, did clearer thinking begin to link sewerage and disease, and the slow, uncomfortable work of change finally begin. Until then, life and matter were intimately mixed, and the hard lessons of that mingling would take generations to be learned. From high above the stonework, the castle looks like a small, stubborn town. A ring of ramparts and towers holding its breath against wind and rain. Stand at the very top of the keep and look down, and the great hall yawns beneath you. A long room of flagged floor and timber beams, a place of light and speeches, and the slow shuffle of daily life. That same fortress, tucked away in another corner, hides a more private kind of architecture. The garderobe, the medieval lavatory, even the postcard view, with its cheeky caption, "A loo with a view" at St. Andrew's Castle, Fife, can't disguise what this place really was. Most of those toilets were nothing more than small antechambers. You would find a bench with a hole in it, a simple timber plank set along a cold stone wall, and the, contents would simply fall, usually from a great height, into a cesspool or even straight into the moat. Because moats were often stagnant, the smell could be unbearable, especially in the heat of summer. It was practical, blunt, and unromantic in the way only necessity can be. Step closer, and the glamour of battlements fades. The privy was not a secret individual cubicle, but a communal fixture of castle life. There were rarely walls or doors to separate one man from another. People sat side by side and did what needed doing. Conversation could and did happen. A clipped remark, idle gossip, or comfortable silence shared between neighbors. In that plain way, the private and public met without ceremony. Hygiene, by modern standards, was poor. Dampness clung to the stones, flies found their way in, and the sharp, unmistakable scent told you the space was designed to dispose rather than to cleanse. Rain and wind announced themselves as they pleased. Any scrubbing that occurred was neither frequent nor elaborate. Yet this was ordinary for the time. The medieval world carried different expectations and far fewer of the rituals of privacy and sanitation we take for granted. Sitting on that bench was not an act meant to be hidden. It was woven into the rhythm of communal life. Try to imagine it. The rough timber beneath you, the cool stone of the wall at your back, a muffled glow seeping through narrow windows or arrow slits. From below comes the sound of the hall, footsteps on flagstones, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of affairs, all part of the same house. In the contrast between the proud sweep of the great hall and the blunt honesty of the lavatory bench, the castle reveals itself whole and human, with its comforts and its compromises. Still, I guess it meant that you always had someone to chat to when on the toilet. When the first wooden palisades and rough stone keeps rose against the skylines of England and Wales, they did more than reshape the view. They rearranged the life of every man and woman who lived beneath their shadow, where scattered farms and extended kinships had once defined the countryside. A new order settled in, pillar by pillar and oath by oath. The castle was not merely a pile of timber and mortar. It was the seed and the sign of a system that folded land, law, and loyalty into a single, living thing. At the heart of that system stood the king, less an everyday neighbor than an image of authority, the claimed custodian of every field and forest under his banner. He did not rule by simple whim. To make order from open land, he parceled it out. He called men he trusted, great lords, barons, men of family, force and fortune, and granted them tracts of earth. Those grants were generous and conditional. A lord could keep his lands, his title, and the people who looked to him so long as his loyalty remained complete. Loyalty was not a vague ideal, but a working bond. Falter, and the gift could be taken back. Stand firm, and the land, the rights, and the responsibilities stayed in his hands. That arrangement turned sprawling territory into tenure. The lord who accepted a parcel became the head of a household that reached far beyond a private dwelling. His castle rose at the center of the land he held, a compact world in stone where authority and domestic life met. Inside its walls he presided in a great hall where wood smoke curled under heavy beams and voices echoed with laughter, dispute, and judgment. There were feasts and proclamations, prayers and quarrels. Outside, flags snapped in the wind over pastures and fields, and under those banners lived the people who kept the estate breathing, the peasants. Between the king and those who tilled the soil stood the vassals, a braided class of men bound by solemn oaths. They came to the castle in ceremony to kneel, hands placed between hands, to swear to defend, advise, and serve. In return they received fiefs, the land to manage and reap, with the duty to provide knights, counsel, and sometimes money or hospitality. These ties were reciprocal, not one-sided orders. The vassal looked to his lord for protection and legal standing. The lord looked to his vassals for soldiers, for support in council, for the muscle that kept order. The bond was personal, public, and enforceable. It could bring honor and more land, or be stripped away if faith failed. Beneath them all were the peasants, who shaped the daily truth of this world. They rose with the dawn to coax grain from the soil, to tend sheep and cattle, to shape the seasons with sowing and harvest. Some were freeholders, holding small plots in return for rent or service. Many more were bound to the land itself, tied by custom as much as necessity, obliged to work the lord's domain, to carry a share of their yield to the manor's store, to grind grain at the lord's mill, and to pay tolls and dues that kept the estate's wheels turning. Their lives were measured by immediate things, the texture of the earth, the whims of weather, the weight of the harvest, and by the larger, slower movements of law and lordship that reached down into every cottage. Inside the castle, servants and retainers kept the household turning like a well-oiled wheel, kitchens filled with the sharp scents of roasting meat and herbs, children of the household watched armor being polished and parchment being sealed. The steward kept the accounts and enforced the rules. The chamberlain tended the private rooms. The marshal oversaw the stables and the training of men-at-arms. The castle was at once home, administration center, barracks, and courthouse. When disputes among villagers could not be settled in the open field, they were brought to the Lord's court. When danger came, bandits on a lonely road or the threat of a rival, people ran to the bailey and found shelter behind its walls. That shelter was part of the bargain, protection for the hands that tilled the soil, translated into duties exacted by the Lord. Workdays known as the corvée, levies in grain or livestock, payments in kind. These were the rhythms that kept the manor functioning. By our standards, the system could be harsh, but it was coherent for its time. Everyone had roles and expectation, and the order held because it met two basic human needs, security and subsistence. Lords offered law, jurisdiction, and defense. Vassals supplied military service and counsel. Peasants brought labor and produce. In return, each received a measure of stability, a place to live, a right to cultivate a strip of land, and the promise that the world beyond their fields would not sweep them away. This world, however, was not frozen. Loyalties were tested, alliances shifted, and castles themselves were in constant repair. Timbers replaced, keeps heightened, new chambers added, flags changed with marriage and inheritance. The faces around the great table altered with births and deaths. Yet through all these changes, the basic structure endured. Land remained the source of wealth and power. Allegiance the glue that held things together. A pyramid of relationships running from the king at the top, through lords and vassals down to the peasants who made life possible. To stand outside one of those early castles was to read the social order in the landscape. The keep rose like an answer to the sky, solid and severe. The outer bailey hummed with work and argument. Hedgerows stitched the fields together, and trackways led away to other holdings. You could see the lines of dependency as plainly as furrows in the earth, the king's authority flowing down through his men, the lord's voice shaping life on his manor, the vassal's oath forming a chain of defense, the peasant's effort feeding them all. It was an ordered world, sometimes merciless, sometimes protective, but always bound by a simple, unyielding truth. Land and loyalty walked hand in hand. These chunks of land were called fiefs, or fees. As medieval times progressed, more and more lords chose to build castles on their estates. Stone beacons meant to project power and shape the world around them. Inside the cool, shadowed heart of Dover Castle's great keep, a modern replica of Henry II's throne sits as if waiting for the court to return. Stone walls rise around it, smoothed by centuries of hands and weather. A damp, sea salt wind finds its way through the narrow arrow slits. When light from a thin window slants across the carved back of the chair, it catches on polished wood and metal, and for a moment you can almost feel the weight of a crown settling into place, and the hush that would fall when a ruler entered the hall. That chair is more than a seat. It is an emblem of authority. It stands at the center of a world where one man's word could shape the lives of many, where the reach of the crown went well beyond the stones of the keep, into the fields and villages that spread like a living map below the battlements. Behind that emblem lay a more human, practical scene. A medieval lord could not till every acre within his domain. The estates were too vast, the crops too demanding, and the duties of rulership, judging disputes, directing defenses, hosting visitors, left no time for the long labor of a plough. So the land was parceled out, sometimes in a quiet exchange, sworn beneath oath, sometimes amid the clatter of a court. The lord allowed others to use his earth. These were his vassals, men who accepted plots and farms, who lived on the land and drew their livelihood from it. Their bond to their lord was not just legal paper, but a web of mutual obligation and dependence that held ruler and ruled together. Among those vassals were the knights, armored and alert, their identity shaped as much by duty as by birth or fortune. They held small domains, and in return for the right to reap the harvests and to wield a measure of power, they pledged service. Their debt was rarely measured in coin. It showed up as readiness, to ride when called, to answer the trumpet of battle, to defend the lord's interests and the borders of his realm. This exchange, land for service, made the lord's authority tangible across the countryside. From the throne in the keep to the horse on a distant hillock, the same chain ran, power granted, loyalty expected, protection promised. Imagine a knight mounting at dawn, his family standing in the yard beneath the same wide sky that the fields need for their crops. Imagine the lord receiving homage inside the keep, conscious that the kingdoms he governs are held together by these human pacts as much as by law. The replica throne at Dover is a quiet witness to those relationships, to the weight of responsibility that settled on a monarch's shoulders, and to the everyday mechanics of a society organized not by solitude, but by interdependence, where land and service braided together to sustain an order that was, for all its harshness, remarkably practical and profoundly human. Who actually farmed the land? It was the peasants, the people at the very bottom of the social pyramid. That pyramid, the whole medieval economic and military system, was built on reciprocal duty, with the king and his lords perched at the apex, power spread downward in obligations and protections, and the everyday toil of fields and flocks held the whole structure upright. The castle rose out of that order, not simply as stone and mortar, but as a pronounced promise. This is where power lives. From a distance its silhouette cut the skyline. Towers like watchful sentinels, battlements jagged against the sky. And up close the walls spoke a language everyone understood. It was a machine of authority, a place where the Lord's voice carried furthest, and where decisions took shape. Around its gates, household and hamlet adjusted their rhythms. Farms bent their labors to its needs, and loyalties folded into its shadow like cloaks at the threshold. Inside, the castle was a small world under pressure, every chamber declaring rank and purpose. The great hall gave the clearest picture. A long table, the lord on a raised dais, banners and tapestries along the walls that told family stories and claims to honor. There was a constant traffic of people, retainers, knights, clerks, servants, each with a known place and task. Conversation and command mixed there. Orders were given, disputes settled, jokes traded, and in that room the rhythm of daily life was set. Below stairs the kitchens roared with a different authority, spits turning, cauldrons boiling, fires that demanded attention. Cooks and scullions moved with a practiced urgency, hands and bodies learning the castle by its smells. the greasy sweetness of frying meat, the sharp tang of smoke, the comforting promise of fresh bread. Up in private chambers, the lady managed household economies and directed servants, a household sovereign in her own right. In the chapel, the chaplain moved with quieter, steadier purpose, binding faith to duty and offering a softer kind of order. Sound and scent made the hierarchy palpable. The clang of armor and the stamping of horses' hooves announced martial readiness. The crackle of hearths and the laughter at feasts signaled comfort and celebration. At the gate, a low murmur of petitions measured dependence, voices rising and falling like tides, and beneath those nobler noises were less flattering impressions. The sourness of refuse, the persistent human smell of many bodies pressed together, reminders that this was not a court of marble and silence, but a living organism, noisy and festive one day, somber and cramped the next. Those contrasts were useful. Ceremony and spectacle, tournaments, banquets, the simple display of banners, reinforced the Lord's status as surely as the keep defended it. The visible ordering of people and space taught everyone their part, who sat near the table, who served the cup, who swore fealty at the threshold. At the same time, the castle was intensely practical, a center for administration, a storehouse for grain and arms, a refuge when danger came. Its walls held both authority and the mess of daily existence, and that mixture made the social system feel both inevitable and natural. To live in a castle was to live inside the structure of medieval society itself. Every laugh, every scolding, every footstep along a corridor echoed the larger world outside the walls, a world organized by rank, obligation, protection, and dependence. In the convergence of power and domesticity, of ritual and labor, the castle compressed an entire age into its rooms, a place of governance and conviviality, of hard work and stubborn ordinary realities that kept a people bound together. A recommended resource, Guy's G&J, Life in a Medieval Castle, Harper Perennial, London, 1976. Imagine a heavy oak door eased open on silent hinges, and beyond it, a world lit by smoke and torchlight, the low hum of daily labor, the gleam of armor at dawn, the steady warmth of a hearth that keeps priests, peasants, and princes awake through long winters. This is the kind of book the Guises have given us, an invitation to step across a threshold into a past that often feels remote and obscure, and to feel it instead as immediate, tactile, and alive. The pages open like a corridor through time, and the authors move less like distant lecturers and more like careful guides. They tug at the tapestry by the great hall and show you both the woven scene and the hands that made it. They lift a goblet so you can see the drink rippling and imagine the voices that rise and fall across the table. Simple details become scenes. The clink of cutlery, the hush that follows a lord's word, a child slipping between benches. You are led past battlements where wind and gulls have stories, into kitchens where the heat tells as much about survival as about hospitality, and into chambers where whispered decisions alter the fortunes of whole regions. The Guises do not merely list facts. They attend to texture and sound. They give you the grit of the courtyard underfoot, the smell of roasted meat that hangs in smoke-thick air, the creak of a leather saddle as a rider mounts at dawn. Torchlight catches on chain and buckle, steam lifts from stewpots, and a stained flag flutters above the gate. Details that let the past speak through the senses rather than hide behind dates and dry names. Published in London in 1976, this work stands as a solid humane bridge between modern curiosity and medieval reality. It is practical for students who need clear, dependable information, rich for readers who hunger for atmosphere, and steady for anyone who wants to understand how people once lived, loved, fought, worked, and worshipped within those stone walls. If you are preparing narration, study, or simply the pleasure of an armchair journey back in time, take this book in hand. It offers history you can almost touch, and it comes wholeheartedly recommended. If you're interested in reading more about medieval castle life, I'd really recommend this book, Life in a Medieval Castle, written by Joseph and Frances Guise. The first thing you notice is how unexpectedly easy it is to read. That surprise is like warm light spilling into a room you had expected to find shuttered. It changes the whole mood. Where you might have braced for dense academic prose, the sentences move with an unforced clarity. Each idea is stitched to the next, so that arguments arrive as if in conversation, not as a parade of impenetrable jargon. The prose breathes. It leans toward you, invites questions and answers them with patience, and never hides behind dense parentheses or an army of footnotes. Instead of the clipped cadence you dread in scholarly writing, the authors let the narrative unfold naturally, offering explanations exactly when you need them and grounding theory in example. Reading this book feels less like trudging through assigned labor and more like following a skilled guide along a path you hadn't known was there. Complex theories are unwrapped gently. Examples appear at the precise moment they become useful. Even the occasional technical term is introduced with a human touch that keeps the page alive, rather than turning it into a checklist of facts. You can hear the author's care in the rhythm of a paragraph, see their careful choices in an economy of words, and feel the relief of understanding settle in like a comfortable chair. The writing has a steady, patient music to it, and that makes the material not only clearer, but more enjoyable. For anyone used to dust-dry tomes, this book is a small revelation, rigorous without being remote, exact without being exhausting, and ultimately, unexpectedly readable. Imagine a single, weathered keep, Chepstow Castle, perched on a Welsh cliff, standing at the heart of a book that spreads outward like the radiating corridors and battlements it describes. The authors put you there first. Your boots scrape damp stone steps. The river wind tugs at your cloak, and the gull cry threads through the yards. Then the lens slowly widens. Chepstow's stones begin to echo with other voices, other towers, other courtyards across Europe, so that each chapter feels like a careful step from one courtyard into another, linking the familiar to the far-off, the local to the continental. This volume sits in a long line of books by the Guise family, works that marry careful scholarship with the instincts of a storyteller. If you have loved their earlier titles, you will recognize the same steady curiosity and exact eye for detail, the way a fragment of masonry can tell a story, or how a discarded spoon can open a window into daily life. The narrative feels companionable rather than distant. It turns the reader into someone walking beside the chroniclers of the past, pausing to touch a weathered lintel, listening to a sentry's footsteps as dusk gathers on the battlements. What makes the book especially satisfying is its balance. Chepstow serves as both anchor and exemplum, but the authors do not stop there. They summon castles from across the continent to deepen, to contrast, to color the picture. Each fortress contributes a different hue to the portrait of medieval life. Fortification, domestic routine, ceremonial ritual, so that the whole becomes richer and more human than any single site could be. The prose itself is made for the ear, measured sentences carrying close observation and a quiet warmth, ideal for a voiceover that wishes to inform and to transport. For anyone who wants a readable, engaging passage into the world of castles, rooted in one memorable place yet generous in scope, this book is a welcome companion. ISBN 978 96740.